Hello, everyone, and welcome to Irenicast, the weekly podcast dedicated to conversations on faith and culture. This week, we have an interview for you conducted by our very own Alan with Joey Aszterbaum. For those of you familiar with late 90s Christian music, you may know his name. He was the guitarist for the band Skypark. He's done many amazing things since then. He's got a great story to tell, so we're really looking forward to presenting this interview to you right now. If you have anything to add to the conversation you're about to hear, you can do that at irenicast.com/49. There you'll also find different links that are mentioned throughout the conversation as well. And don't forget, next week is our 50th episode, and we are going to do another listener feedback episode. So if you'd like to communicate to the show your ideas for a segment or questions or comments or topics you'd like us to discuss, you can get a hold of us in many different ways, and all the ways are listed at irenicast.com/feedback. So without any further ado, here is this week's interview.
Hello, everyone. This is Alan. We are sans Jeff and Mona for this episode, but I am pleased, I'm honored to introduce you to the one and only Joey Aszterbaum.
Hello. Thanks for having me. This is Serial, right? On NPR?
That's right. This is NPR. Thank you so much for coming on. You may have heard Joey in the past playing guitar for the Christian band Skypark in the 90s, or read his work on faith, art, and justice at the Charismanglican, or perhaps you saw him on television marching against the anti-immigration protesters in Murrieta, California. Joey has been an outspoken advocate of peace, even to the extent of being terminated for his religious convictions, a family man, and from what I hear, this is what I hear, a recent Bernie Sanders supporter. Is that right?
That is true. Yeah, I'm a volunteer with this campaign, and I'm basically feeling sick right now because the Iowa caucuses are happening.
As we speak, they're tallying them up, right? They're counting all of them, and yeah, that's wonderful. Joey, I'm excited to have you on the show, not just because you're an interesting person. I do fully believe that all people are interesting and love to talk to people, but I'm excited to have you on because I personally admire you and wanted to hear more of your story and thought that I would introduce you to our listeners. So thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, no, it's a real honor. You are literally one of only 3 people that admire me. So that works out really well.
Awesome. So yeah, you were in the band Skypark back in the day, and Jeff and Mona, my other co-hosts, have told me multiple times, do not screw up this interview with the Skypark guy, because they listened to your band all the time growing up. My wife actually was singing Am I Pretty all day long when she found out that you were going to be on the show, because that's
wow.
Yeah, literally they lived on the central coast of California. I don't know if you guys had a huge following, but you've traveled all over the United States playing music, right? I mean, one of your songs was nominated for a Dove Award, and anyway.
Yeah, we were lucky. Actually, we got to travel a lot outside the United States too.
Really?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
I am really grateful for that experience. And
was that all throughout the 90s, or?
For about 7 years, and then ending in 2000. I shouldn't say ending. In the year 2000, our record label, which was Word Records, they're one of the major gospel labels. They were trying to break out, so they hired us to basically be a mainstream rock band. We were distributed by Sony Epic, but then their label was bought by Warner Brothers. And so our dynamic changed after that. Tyrone, our lead singer, Tyrone Wells, started his solo career, but we never broke up as a band and released another independent album in 2006. And I think we still have an album in us, but we'll see.
Yeah, I saw that you guys got together recently, and maybe in the last 2 or 3 years.
We celebrated our 20-year anniversary as a band. And it was really a blast.
So your band can almost drink beer now that it's 20 years old. It's just on the cusp of maturity.
Our band is legally allowed to campaign for Bernie Sanders. I just don't know if any of the rest of them will. So,
well, so Bernie Sanders. So Skypark, Bernie Sanders, anti-immigration. There's so much that I would love to ask you about and want you to talk about. So it's kind of hard to find an even beginning area. And I figure we'd kind of start where I came to know you. And that was when you were writing for a blog you called the Charismanglican, kind of the charismatic Anglican smashed together. And in your blog, you talked about you went through a period of deconstructing your faith and then reconstructing your faith. And I'm curious to know, what was that experience for you? What were you deconstructing? Was that your Skypark days that you were kind of pulling apart and thinking about critically? And what did it look like to put pieces back together?
Well, I became a Christian when I was age 12. And it was within the non-denominational Christian churches of Christ. And it was a cool church too. I mean, at first it was just, I was one of the only people under 60, but as it grew, it became like the cool church to be a part of. A really large church, by compared to what I'm involved in now. So, and throughout that time, I've always been a thinking Christian. That doesn't mean that I'm good at it, but that I've never really taken things for granted. I've always wanted to grow. My faith has always been very central to who I am. And it's funny because I think if I met, 14-year-old Joey, he probably wouldn't think I was a Christian. And I'd probably think he was a really aggravating human being. But I take it that people grow in their faith the way that they grow in other areas of their life. So what happened is, I would say, in the mid to late 90s, and even a little earlier, but especially in college, there was just a lot of stuff that I was learning that didn't fit in the paradigm of my fundamentalist upbringing. I had a very passionate faith, and yet, even as one of the most involved people in church, I still felt like there was a lot more to the Christian life that I felt I was missing. And it was in the later 90s that I came across a book. It's really funny, actually. I can't remember the author's name all of a sudden, but the book was called Soul Tsunami. And I think the author's first name was Lee.
As in like the storm coming in.
Yes. Yeah. And Soul Tsunami was about postmodernism and Christianity and these were things that I didn't know about, as far as a postmodern turn. And so that led me kind of down a rabbit hole where I was like, wait a second, people feel the way that I do. They feel that there's something missing in church and that, it's not really connecting the way that it ought to, that it doesn't feel authentic or very meaningful or just not meet the world in a way that was very interesting. It was kind of a subculture in a ghetto. And, that combined with being a musician in the Christian music world and not in the Christian music world, playing clubs and other things, I really just felt increasingly guilty about us being involved in the Christian music industry.
Really? Well, one of my questions was going to be, did you ever feel pressure? Like, what is it like to be in a Christian band? I don't play music, and I've been to lots of like concerts and stuff for Christian music, but do you ever feel pressured in a Christian band to kind of perform your faith or be what other people in the churches expect you to be all the time?
I'm not going to be mean to you. Literally, that is such a 1998 question.
Is it really? I haven't changed since 1998, so.
Yeah. And I mean, that's not, but people who listen to you, they may not know that. But it actually, probably there were people like Amy Grant that were dealing with that in the 80s. Mm-hmm. Jars of Clay was dealing with that when I was in college. And so it was a big issue for a lot of people back then. There was very little pressure on us, I think, because we just loved each other so much. We were very much a band. We were not, some solo artists that hired backup guys. We did not have a changing lineup. We loved each other deeply. And so there's a sense where we really had our thing and everybody else was kind of along for the ride. So I feel like we were pretty authentic in terms of that. When we wrote about our faith, it was because we cared about our faith, not because of other reasons. And when we wrote about girls or anger or, frustrations, relationships, love, politics, when we wrote about that stuff, we wrote about that from a place of honesty too. We didn't feel like we had to really tamp anything down. We just went with our own things. So I don't think it was as much of a struggle for us as it was for other bands. The only difference being that increasingly I felt we had no place in the Christian music industry. And in the year 2000, after our album Over Blue City came out, we particularly lobbied with the record company to get out of our contract.
Because of the things that you believed, or?
Yeah, because I just felt like, it wasn't that I felt that we had to change anything about our message or about our art, because I felt we were hitting our stride. It was more to me about not wanting to be part of the commercial aspects of Christian music, feeling that Christian music, probably one of the moments that was very definitive for me, the band, we were distributed by Sony. And in the year 2000, we went to Sony's headquarters in Los Angeles. There we met with the marketing team and other executives. And we played some songs that we had from the new record. We played them acoustically. And it was a really extraordinary performance. It should have been pretty boring because it's people who are number crunchers. And at the time, before digital music, it was still a major label world. People still made their living selling records instead of touring.
And that doesn't happen anymore, right? Because people are pirates and stuff and steal stuff off the internet or whatever. Yeah. It's just so widely available.
And ironically, like, I'm not against that. I'm actually really for it. You can get Skypark's most recent album, No Ambition. You can download it for free online or contribute. but it's not what I'm in it for. And so, but yeah, it's been devastating to the record industry. But by the time the late 90s were coming around, the music industry was totally run by lawyers and accountants. It was not about people who really cared about the art. And there were a few. Our A&R guy named Bubba Smith, he's won various Grammys for producing records. He was nothing but good to us. And he was in Nashville, and he's like, "You guys have probably moved to Nashville." And we were like, "Nope." We were Orange County all the way. But no, we didn't feel that pressure. But what happened is when we played at the Sony headquarters for the marketing people, here are people who are supposed to be pretty cynical about music. And we played a couple of our best songs, and we got a standing ovation. Like, it was basically a business meeting, and they stood up for us. And one of the things, for us, it was really a joy because we really wanted people to react, to feel like our music set them free from bad jobs. Mm-hmm. And I'm not even kidding about that. We called our style of music Beyond Employment. And when we were on tour, we would stop at temp agencies and give free albums away.
That's awesome. That's something that's some work that you still continue today, right? Aren't you involved in helping people find jobs and things like that?
I am. Yeah. Not at a temp agency. I work for social services. So it's with the poor.
That's cool.
And people who are on cash aid. Yeah. I love it. So anyway, we played for these bigwigs, and they're pretty jaded, and they gave us a standing ovation. And so there was a little bit of a love fest going, and we hung out with them, and, it was really a good thing. And then the record label, their whole marketing thing and how they communicated our music to Sony was so based on just what they knew about Christian music that, the phrase that we used back then was they queered the deal. Mm-hmm. They were just their thinking was too small and too conservative. They wanted a mainstream band, but didn't want to take the actions necessary to make it happen, and really didn't utilize that relationship with Epic very well. And it was kind of the beginning of the end. I mean, we just recognized that we didn't really fit. So yeah, there's that. I mean, I've never really been into Christian music.
I was going to say that's a shame because we could have used one more long-standing corporate Christian band in the world.
It really was our goal to be the third incarnation of Petra. So,
yes.
No,
yes.
And, at the time there was this explosion of Christian musicians like alternative, ska, punk, hardcore.
Mm-hmm.
And we played with a lot of bands like POD and Switchfoot. Yeah, we played with a lot of those bands that kind of were breaking mainstream. But no matter what happens, if I'm switching, still to this day, if I'm switching the dial on my radio, I don't have to know. I know when it's a Christian station immediately by the quality.
Yeah, that's true.
And yet, I'm just being honest. I mean, some of our music's interesting. I love listening to it, but I've always been a bigger fan of music than a producer of music. And I just would never be our Hughes, as much as I wanted to be, Radiohead and the Beatles, and Nirvana. I've never written a single song as good as any of those bands. Mm. And performing was really our thing. We were really good live. I actually think that if YouTube was a thing in the late 90s, early 2000s, that our band would have just blown up.
Absolutely. The world would have been very different.
Yeah. Which is, again, not really boasting of our skills. Mm-hmm. I mean, there was a skill in performing.
Well, we all loved your music. I had never been to a concert. So far as I know, my wife never did, but like we didn't know each other growing up, but we had your guys' CD. We also had other people you named, like Switchfoot and POD and all of them. All those, like, and then a lot of the garage bands. You said ska and punk. I feel like I'm reliving my childhood because I had all these CDs, and I think I even took your CD and propped open the CD player and spun it while it was open and like drew on it and stuff like that to make it look cooler. Anyway,
nice.
Yeah, so I had this really deep emotional connection to.
That's I got to tell you, I never felt it's the weirdest thing. I never felt famous while we were in Skypark. We traveled to Hong Kong. We traveled to Central and South America. We traveled to Europe. For some reason, we had a following in Alaska. So we went there probably 6 times, which is beautiful, just a beautiful place. And, we never felt famous except one time we were in Puerto Rico playing at a military base. The Pentagon had hired us to do a tour of military bases in the year 2000. And
wow.
It was amazing. A really strange experience. And it was before 9/11, so we played at Guantanamo Bay.
Wow.
So not a lot of
a lot of people have been there.
Right.
Seriously.
Yeah. And I when we played in Puerto Rico, for some reason there were kids who were, and when I say kids, probably late teens, early 20s, there were young people that were Puerto Ricans, but they worked on the base, but they were locals. Mm-hmm. They weren't continentals. And they, for some reason, this group of kids were way into our band. And so even if we played, the biggest crowd we ever played to was in Holland, and it was like 9,000 people, but we weren't the headliner. But we played 3 concerts there, and they were pretty wild. But here we were in Puerto Rico. None of the soldiers cared to see us. Like there was like only a handful of people there. But these kids brought all of their friends because they were like, "Oh my gosh, Skypark's here!" And it's the only. I thought, wow, people somewhere know us before we played the music. So we must, it was the only time we ever felt famous. Mm-hmm. There's been a couple times actually in the last, like, say 10 years where Tyrone, because he's been very successful, he was on Universal Records, and now he's a successful solo artist. And even if people don't, hearing this, don't know the name Tyrone Wells, you've heard his music. It's been on television and movies. It's playing on the radio. He's not a household name, but he's done well. And every once in a while, he'll spend time with an up-and-coming band or some famous songwriter or whatever. Every once in a while, he'll send us a note saying that they were actually influenced by our band.
Wow.
And that makes me feel really good. Like, wow, somebody even cared. And then there's a part of me that feels sad for them because I'm like, you were into my band? What is wrong with you?
That's your message for all of the former Skypark fans, is that there has to be something legitimately wrong with you.
Yeah. So,
hey, that was the point, though. That was the point of listening to your kind of music, is that I fully embraced having something wrong with me, and that's why I listened. It's true.
I'm glad that I could judge you. No, but you know what? We really were influenced by anything and everything. And so we did not fit a particular genre. We really did not fit at the time because, you mentioned the ska and the punk thing and also rap rock. So at the top, when we made our best record and with Ed Stacy, I'm one of the world's greatest rock producers. He's worked with, the Ramones and Lemmy Kilmister and I don't even know if I'm saying that name right, but the Misfits. He produced Living Colors, Grammy-winning album, the one with the Cult of Personality, and he also produced the Smithereens. So this is, it was an honor, like super awesome. We worked with this incredible producer. We made the best record we could, and then everything kind of fell to pieces. And we didn't really have a definable genre. Well, just at that moment, what was really happening all of a sudden was boy bands and rap rock. I mean, it was NSYNC and it was Limp Bizkit.
And you guys chose not to break boy band and go that direction.
Yeah. I will say that I enjoy boy bands more than Limp Bizkit. So,
so there's that.
I will also say that I've seen a movie directed by Fred Durst and it was good.
Really?
I'll go on record. Yeah. And you know who was in it? Was both Jason Ritter and lead, and I'm an idiot for forgetting his name, but it's the guy from The Social Network.
I don't know.
Jesse Eisenberg. He was in Zombieland.
Okay, yeah.
He was just in a great stoner comedy.
I haven't watched Social Network, believe it or not, even though I run a podcast. I have seen Zombieland though, and I do love that actor.
Oh yeah, Eisenberg's great. He was just in a stoner comedy with that girl from Twilight.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's right.
And it was really fun. I don't think I'm supposed to say that.
You're allowed to say whatever you want. That's fantastic.
It was
cool.
Really a good film. Just like Jason Bourne, but with a lot of weed. And it was just a very strange and fun little indie film. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, it was good. From
Skypark, I don't know what the time frame is exactly, but you at some point started writing for a blog called the Charismanglican. Can you tell us how that began?
Yeah, well, for your listeners, once upon a time there were things called blogs, and people cared.
Yes,
and there's very little of that now. I mean, honestly,
there's some remnants. There's like clickbait every now and then when you go on Facebook and see someone has shared an article that's outlandish.
There are pretty good blogs, but I just don't subscribe or read them.
Mm-hmm.
But I know a couple of people who make livings, or people who are intellectuals, public intellectuals that blog. And I'll read that stuff, but you have to post it on Facebook for me to know it exists.
But back when you began, it was okay to have a cult following, right? Of people that read blogs and
I suppose them. You start a blog for some of the same reasons you start a band. You think that you're interesting. And
not that you have something to say, it's just that you think you're interesting. That's it.
Right. Well, you have something to say, but that's more of a side effect of thinking that you're interesting.
Maybe.
It's I have something to say and it's important. And you just put it out there into the ether. You might as well be scribbling in the sand on the beach.
But it gets better, right? Over time. I remember, I actually reached out to you when I started my blog. And I asked you some things because I had read a lot of what you had written and really loved it. And one of your comments was, when you do start writing or doing a blog, make sure that you make all your mistakes first, because it's an evolving process and it's something that you kind of get used to. So blogging, has it helped you formulate thoughts or opinions or kind of structure what you're going, because you talked about in your blog deconstructing faith and then kind of building it back up? Was writing stuff an important element of that for you?
Well, gosh, I think I started writing really after that happened.
Hmm.
The gist is sometime around 1999, I started going through a deconstruction of my faith. And deconstruction, I mean, in very broad sense. Um, not the technical like postmodern philosophy, continental philosophy.
Hmm.
There's a bit of that, but basically just disassembling, taking apart my faith. And I feel looking back that it wasn't me doing that, but it was God. If I can be so bold as to say that the Holy Spirit was like pulling me apart,
Hmm.
pulling apart my thoughts. But at the time, it didn't feel that way. It just felt like I started realizing things that I believed that weren't true. And I started just questioning the relevance of it. And it was an interesting process. At first, you're excited because you're like, wow, a lot of other people are going through this. That's what the literature that I was studying was showing me. But at the same time, I felt like I was learning everything I didn't believe, but I didn't know what I believed. And there was a real turning point. I remember I was meeting with a friend of mine. He was a youth minister, and we were going to go jogging. And that was a turning point. One, because I will never go jogging again.
You're like, that was the last time. Never
Seriously.
again.
That's one thing the Holy Spirit taught me is don't jog. So yeah. So the other, but I said to him, I said, I'm concerned because when I get to the end of this, I don't know if God will be there.
Mm.
That I feel like I'm going deeper into a place where my faith's just being totally taken apart, and I don't know, and everything was up in the air. I mean,
I think a lot of our listeners can relate to you. The feedback that we get is that people have been in that process, and there's a lot of fear involved, wondering where you're going to go.
Yeah, and there's lots of people who grew up in fundamentalist situations that I did that either because they wanted to, get drunk and screw, like, and that was against their very strict moralistic understanding, they walked away from the faith. And then others who, because of a very basic understanding of science and a fundamentalist worldview, that they more grew out of it intellectually and abandoned the faith. For me, there was a philosophical and theological thing happening where it was like, wow, I just don't know why I should or can believe these components. And
you fail to see how they connected in some relevant way to the real world.
And so they're just like being stripped apart. It's like everything up for grabs. I mean, everything orthodox, the deity of Christ, the resurrection, the afterlife, just really in a place where all that stuff wasn't making sense or didn't cohere.
Mm-hmm.
And there were 7 years of this. And at first it's just, hey, maybe we should do church different. And by the end, it's that heavy stuff like, what are we talking about when we say God? I mean, and I told my friend, I said, look, I feel like I've been going through this for 7 years now, which I think is a significant number for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
I've been going through this for 7 years now, and I know what I don't believe anymore, but I don't know what I do believe anymore.
Mm.
And I'm worried that, that I'm in this life where God is pulling my faith apart, and I just don't know if he'll be there at the end. And my friend said something so wise, oddly enough, just quoting the book of Ecclesiastes. And he doesn't remember doing this. And it actually was a mercy. He was a very conservative guy, still is. And so instead of freaking out or hating me or trying to talk me out of it, he just said, there's a time to tear down and a time to build. And for some reason, those few words made me think, oh, this is just the time to tear down. And what I'm longing for God to put me back together, like that will happen in time.
Mm.
For some reason, it just got rid of the anxiety of that. And it wasn't long after that I discovered, what I like to call a handful of authors. There are 5 of them. And that started putting my faith back together in a way that was fresh. And that saved me from total cynicism regarding the church.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people who went through what I went through, they have very individualistic senses of church, very consumeristic senses of church, or just bailed on Christianity. And for some reason, I was one of those people that things got kind of put back together in a much more grace-filled and kind of, I want to use the word orthodoxy, which will sound boring to people. It'll sound boring to people, but you don't realize when you grow up fundamentalist how rich and diverse and how open and how big tent orthodoxy is. In the fundamentalist world, orthodoxy means that you have to believe all the right things.
The small sliver that you belong to at that
right.
moment.
Exactly. And everybody else is wrong. And people who aren't Christians, they feel it. They feel the judgment and the arrogance. But what they don't know maybe is that that's happening in the church. Like the church down the street is evil,
Yeah.
Like there's no connection. There's a lot of, and fortunately, by the grace of God, I found these 5 authors. I found the Ecclesia Project through some of those authors. And then I also happened to accidentally go to an Episcopal church. And so what I thought was Christianity was really just a kiddie pool. It was just a very modern incarnation of a very small population in a very limited amount of time in a limited part of the world, basically Western white Protestantism American,
So a key component of what you put back together when you were able to step out of feeling like this was happening to you and start to do some of the good work of actually rebuilding, one of the key components was seeing a much wider thing to belong to, right?
Well, I can't say I saw it. First of all, I just feel like it's important to give some love to those 5 authors.
Yeah.
And weirdly, I'm in a place now where I'm much more critical of their thinking, but I don't care. I still feel very deeply indebted and loving towards them because they were like midwives to bring me into a more relaxed and graceful faith.
That is such a good analogy. I think a lot of us can relate to having people who have helped us along the way. And even though we don't end up being with them, you still feel that connection and appreciate them for helping you get to where you're at.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah,
Midwives. Interesting. So what are some of the authors that you have?
The first midwife is Brian McLaren.
Generous Orthodoxy and other books that he's written. He's written a lot, right?
Yeah, it was weird. I read the trilogy, the pseudo fictional, somewhat related to his life trilogy of A New Kind of Christian, but I read them backwards. I don't know why, but I read them backwards, and they.
You're a nonconformist.
I really felt like I was there, And the thing is, McLaren at the time was very much involved in the whole emerging church thing. And I was really imbibing of like emerging church. Like for a while, I was kind of in that realm, but I think I hinted at already that I feel like it's very individualistic and consumeristic now.
Yeah.
It's even more atomistic, I should say, like atom. It's even more atomized, even more
split apart and individualized, like
exactly. Yeah, it's kind of like sheep without a shepherd, and
like disconnected from historical like tradition and Christianity in a bigger sense.
Yeah, and I don't mean because there's always going to be diversity. There's always going to be change. I don't take it that orthodoxy means consistency or just whatever's oldest is true. But there's a sense in which the postmodern world there was a time where deconstructing all of these things outside of myself, what happened is it finally had deconstructed myself, where I thought, wait, how am I making these decisions? Why am I making these decisions? What powers have influenced me? And what are the desires, in me leading me to? And is that really the human experience? Are we really just individual monads, without any story? We just kind of invent ourselves. And that seemed like a type of slavery to me, to be honest. That seemed like somebody who really just was incredibly alone.
So there are some people that would say it's the opposite. Like buying into a story is subjecting yourself, and the true freedom to just create yourself apart from everybody else is real freedom.
for me, that there's a name for that, and it's called capitalism. Like, capitalism wants you to be an individual consumer who constantly reinvents yourself, because then you'll buy it.
I have to say, this is one of the reasons why I did want to have you on here, is because your insistence upon the fact that there is something wrong with the military industrial complex and the capitalistic system that we have has been consistent. I would say that I've seen what you've written over the last maybe 4 or 5 years, and that's kind of one theme that has always come up in what you've said. And yeah, that's wonderful.
well, here's so just to shout out the other guys. The other person was N.T. Wright. From N.T. Wright, I discovered Stanley Hauerwas and William Kavanaugh. And from them, then connecting with the Ecclesia Project and also reading John Howard Yoder. And so, what's interesting about that is how broad it is. McLaren is from
Emergent.
like a liberal Protestant.
N.T. Wright's Anglican. Yoder is Mennonite, right?
Right. Hauerwas was Methodist, but is now in the Episcopal Church.
Really?
Yeah, he has been for a long while.
Okay.
He likes to joke that he's a high church Mennonite. And then William Kavanaugh being a Roman Catholic. And so just drawing from these different wells was really helpful for me. But what it also did was it placed me in a story that wasn't my own. Mm-hmm. And Hauerwas has a way of saying, and again, although I'm critical of all these guys, there's still stuff that got its hooks in me.
Yeah.
And one of the things Hauerwas says is, one of the things about Americans, the American story, is that it's created these people who feel like they could invent this story. Gosh, now I'm forgetting.
That's okay.
Basically, it's created a people who believe that they have no story and they can just invent a story. But the reality is that each of us, we don't start at the beginning. We start in the middle of the story. Mm-hmm. And I started realizing that everything, it's funny with America, everybody's proud of being an American, but you're in the middle of a story by the time you're an American. Like, you didn't have a choice. Most of us didn't have a choice and move here. Like, it's just assumed you're that. And yet, then when we're going to be Christians, we make all these decisions. Like, it has to be about a personal decision. Whereas I started realizing that there was something too that people have preserved. There's something, it's funny, for all my critiquing of militarism and capitalism, I think I'm a very conservative person in this regard. I really do appreciate what happened between the ancient world and the modern world. Mm-hmm. I really care. And in regards to church, that means that I didn't just become a Christian. I inherited these long decades and centuries and couple millennia where people preserved this beautiful thing in this story, and they gave it to me. And they gave me my baptism. They gave me the Holy Spirit. In a sense, there's this thread, and it goes against that idea that I can just choose whatever religion I want. Now, that being said, I feel like you can choose not to be part of a religion, but it's, I wasn't born in a Christian family. In some sense, I did choose it. But in another sense, I was in that circumstance. Some people aren't. And I just want to receive it as a gift rather than have to reinvent the wheel. And so it was really weird. And a lot of that is being involved in the general Catholic, what I like to call the broadly Catholic tradition, which would be, the 3 major branches of Christianity: Orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Anglican. Those broadly liturgical traditions, to me, when I go to church and I pray the creed, I'm not as concerned anymore. Do I believe everything here in a literalistic way? Some days I believe things differently than I do the next. And everybody changes. I mean, talk to me in 20 years. I'm going to believe differently than I do.
It sounds to me like belonging. And this is something McLaren talked about a long time ago. Belonging before believing, and how you get to participate even if you don't believe in all of the 16 points that the church has for you, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so it sounds like you can accept church tradition because you don't have to go through and pick apart every single, just like your 5 authors, there are things that you appreciate and things that you don't. You still receive them as people who have had a very, you even said as midwives, people who have like brought life into you, like delivered you into the place that you're at. And you can look through Christian history and see that all of these people, whether they got things right or wrong, or I agree one day and maybe not the next, you're still connected to them and you can receive them even if you don't fully agree. And maybe that's kind of a freeing way to look at church history.
And you know what, too, is that you also, I don't know if you went through this, but I think for a lot of people, when you leave your parents' house, you start getting angry at the way that they raised you. And you have to come to terms with and forgive your parents for being human instead of being gods. Absolutely. And so I think there's a little bit of that. Like I found myself in that process, even to the extent where, you know, there's this adolescence when I was involved in like the emerging church mindset. There's this adolescence that just defines yourself against the fundamentalism that you grew up in. Mm-hmm. But now that I'm an Episcopalian, I'm actually grateful that I grew up in a fundamentalist church. I think there was a lot of harm there. I don't think everybody makes it out alive, but there was also a lot of energy. They took their faith seriously, and I know a lot about the Bible. Yeah. And your general Catholic, they're not always going to know the Bible. They're going to know how to pray it. But I don't know. That's just something, I'm not better than them for it, but it's something that deeply enriches my thought world. Even though my beliefs about the Bible are just, you know, totally different than they were back then, at least it's kind of, I think it's been earned honestly. Yeah. By knowing it. And so anyways, yeah, so about 7 years of deconstruction, I was almost totally cynical about the faith. I ended up going to an Episcopal church, and I was actually leading worship at, I wouldn't say a mega church, but 800, 1,200 people. Cool church, you know, like rock band, lights, stage.
You're a guitarist too, right? That's what you were for Skypark. And
at church I would lead and play guitar sometimes. Mostly I would play drums and run sound. I mean, basically anything to make everything a production, you know. Mm-hmm. And having been in rock and roll, I started just realizing how rather than bringing Christ in the marketplace, we were bringing the marketplace to Christ. Mm. And I was like peddling religious goods and services. And I was just becoming aware of the high cost of what it means to be a Christian. Whereas in the past, I would have thought, well, that means that, you know, it's about sexual morality or it's about, you know, cursing and, you know, just weird stuff, all the things that you think
everything
of.
In the 90s. It's about people with piercings, like spray painting a wall, right? All those bad things that you have to avoid.
Yeah. And what's funny is that this has been an issue for a long time. My father-in-law has worked in the church since he was a young man. And he has a phrase. He says, you know, I don't smoke, curse, or chew or go with girls who do.
That's right. I've heard that.
Yeah, it's really funny. And he knows that that's not what Christianity is about. And he'll say that. And then, I don't know if it's just every generation of Protestants have to deal with that.
Wait, you say so Christianity is not about avoiding those things, or it's just not about those things?
Yeah, it's just not about what we're not. It's about the love of God in Christ. And
sounds like I think Paul said something like that, right? It's not about following the law, but following in the Spirit. Mm-hmm.
And I just, you know, I've gone through that period where you've kind of forgive who you were and you forgive the church that you came through and you realize that the whole history of the church has been, you know, a lot of brokenness and people making dreadful mistakes that hurt a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And yet there's this miracle somewhere in the middle of it too, that changes you. And so, you know, I went from this sort of Christian that wanted to do all the cool new things to somebody who's really super bored with that, just wants to go to like a boring, you know, Eucharist service at the Episcopal church, because that excites me.
Yeah.
I need something that is authentically religious, that's strange, that doesn't fit the culture, that isn't marketable, that calls me back to a quieter center and to a contemplative thing and a humbling thing where my own desires aren't what's important, but rather just the acceptance that you receive. It's things as simple as just saying you're sorry and, and being fed bread and wine. And especially in the Episcopal Church, I don't want to be one of those guys that is trying to peddle church.
Sure. Yeah.
I just don't want to do that. But the Episcopal Church just really suits me.
That's cool.
I just,
those simple things can be really powerful.
yeah. I mean, and it's caught a lot of hell. Before a lot of the other churches, it was already, ordaining people who
it's the
were
hipster
not
church. They were already involved before everybody else was, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, especially in regards to
yeah,
ordaining women and ordaining gays.
Yeah,
and
LGBTQ issues. They just recently there's some things between them and the Roman Catholic Church recently, right?
And it's, and even then, it's just, I don't know, it's a really humble place. Let's just say that people there, you can believe all sorts of wacky stuff, and it's okay, because mostly it's about praying together. There's a saying in the Episcopal Church, and actually in the broad Catholic tradition, but it's really important in the Anglican Church and the Episcopal Church, and that is lex orandi, lex credendi, which means the law of prayer is the law of belief. And so it's not about your beliefs, but that as we pray together, somehow that's more what we believe. Like it's actual fellowship and being in the presence of God,
rather than the intellectual assent to some proposition.
Oh,
yeah.
It was really funny when we were attending St. Albans, which was our first Episcopal church. There was a youth minister there. And not a youth minister like a lot of churches have, like a cool youth minister that they hire. This is like some guy who they give a couple $100 just like take care of teenagers.
Those are the only two ways to be youth pastors, just so you know. I was a youth pastor for 7 years, and it was like the big production, lots of, big youth group. And then I've worked for churches where it's what you're describing. It's we're going to give you $100 to teach the Bible just occasionally, for sure.
Right. Yeah. And so this guy was really interesting. I talked to him and I said, "So have you always been an Episcopalian?" And he said, "Yeah. I took some time. I went to a free church like you grew up in, and I've never heard my tradition called the free church." So I was like, "Free church? Like, what is that? What is this then? Slave church? I don't know." And he said, so he had been going. I don't remember if it was Calvary or some other, non-denominational Southern California, whatever, disconnected Protestants.
That's the perfect name for a new denomination. Non-denominational Southern California, whatever.
Right, yeah.
I like it.
Well, I can tell you, I've been all over the world, and everywhere you go to a Calvary chapel, it's the same thing in Southern California. It's totally a colony of Southern California. That's not a compliment. So,
that's not a compliment.
So anyways, so I asked him, I said, "Yeah, what was that like?" And he goes, "Well, I really liked it at first, it was really upbeat and really fun. But then I had to come back, I realized that I liked worship that was more about Christ than it was about the issues." And of course, I grew up in these churches that claimed that they were all about Jesus and the Bible. And so I was confused by that. I didn't know what he meant. This is early in my sojourn. And he said, and I said, "The issues, what do you mean?" And he goes, "Well, here, when we worship, it's about communion and it's about all these prayers, and Christ is the center of it. And when I went there, it was a lot of talking about like abortion or gays or
morality issues."
Yeah. And I never, it was so weird to hear reflected back to you.
The very thing that you've accused others of.
Right.
Yeah.
It was so, and I realized that it's like all these Bible churches, you go to the Episcopal Church and you got like, people reading the scriptures actually and spending all this time in prayer. And then there's churches that just, read little bits of scripture and tell you what you should be doing in your life. There's something a little bit cavalier about that. And in the Episcopal Church, it's a lot more humble. I just can't sell it. Honestly, it's too strange and too boring. And you got to submit yourself to it. And who wants to do that in America? So it's just, it's totally clear to me why the Episcopal Church is dying, so to speak. And I'm just at a place in my life where I don't care. Because what's so bad about dying?
Yeah. You actually are known now, at least some circle of friends, as somebody who likes sloths, right? Like live slow, die whenever, that like meme that kind of has been going around.
Okay. So first of all, it's important for me. I don't know. a loose end, the Charismanglican blog, I got rid of it years ago.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I was going to clarify that. It has not been live, right?
Yeah.
I sent myself a few links that were to your blog that I've tried to look up, and it doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I think the NSA started like
keeping tabs on
you. Keeping tabs, yeah. No, sloths. Here's the thing. Sloth is one of the seven deadly sins.
Yes.
Okay, but I think sloths, the animal, like that's a misnomer. Like they're not lazy.
They get a bad rap.
Yeah, they're the Sabbath animal. They're not slothful. They're just like relaxing. And I'm a very high-strung person. My mind's always running. I've got a lot of cares and concerns. Because our family has had financial struggles for years now, there's something about looking at a sloth where a sloth is just going to take it easy. And just when I look at them, I'm going to sound crazy to your listeners now. I'm literally obsessed with sloths. When I look at a sloth, I feel this peace. Like it's totally my spirit animal.
It's a religious icon for you in your faith.
It really is. And when I get another tattoo, it's totally going to be a sloth. When I ever have money for a tattoo, and it's because like I look at them and the sloth says to me, he's like, Joey, don't worry about bills. Like, don't worry about, just relax, man. That's what sloths say to me. And so, yeah, they really are just like a totem of peace. And I've got them all over my workspace at the office. And
as far as faith goes, isn't that what Jesus talked about? The burden being light and easy to bear, as opposed to something that you have to work and sell. And you said that before, selling church or selling kind of all of life. It is a hectic pace and something that's very difficult for a lot of people. A lot of our listeners actually have said stuff like that before.
It seems related, but I've always, my whole life, I've always had depression between Thanksgiving and Christmas. I'm not good at buying things. I hate rushing around. I feel like the whole message of peace on earth is bogus. There's no peace. And especially not when Christmas is coming, everybody's stressed out and just totally bought into this.
And maxing out their credit cards to show that they love someone. Right.
Yeah. and the thing is, until I fell into the Episcopal Church and there was a religious practice associated with it. Whereas I used to say, religion, Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship. I'm like, no, it's a religion.
Yeah.
Like the religion part of it helps me to have a relationship that's much broader and much deeper. And so, yeah, sloths are kind of like messengers from God saying, peace on earth.
Yeah. That's awesome.
And like, so yeah, I love them. And I'm actually so psycho about them. There's a video, if you look online, there's a video of Kristen, what's her name, who played Veronica Mars.
I have no idea. I'm really bad with pop culture references.
She's married to Dax Shepard, and she's in Frozen. So anyways, Kristen, I'm such a jerk for forgetting.
That's okay. We'll put it in the show notes. So people can check it out.
She's obsessed with sloths, and she was on Ellen. And if you just look up Ellen and Kristen and sloths, you'll see this video where she has this epic meltdown where she's like curled in a fetal position, having a full-on panic attack because she realizes that a sloth is going to come into her house.
What?
Because
she's excited about the sloth coming.
Dax Shepard comes home and says, there's something special that I did for you. She gets intuition that it's a sloth, and she literally curls up on her bed sobbing because she's always waited for that for her whole life. And that sounds insane. And I watched that video and I wept.
You're like, I'm the same way.
I know. I was like, there's more of us.
It's not just you.
Yeah, so sloths seem to be having kind of a cultural moment.
Yeah.
I don't know why, but it's like if there's ever one single sloth thing that you see, 20 people have messaged it to me on Facebook.
I've done that.
Yeah, and I don't want to be mean. So I'm always like, yeah, nice, thanks.
It's the complete opposite of the like Protestant work ethic, the whole like you have to earn your place, and I don't know, there's the whole message that we've confused with the gospel or with even the point of life, and it strikes at the heart of that. So I appreciate it a lot.
Dang, you just got real deep about sloths. Are you sure you're not crazy about sloths like I am?
I might be. I don't know. They're a little scary, like the long fingers. I don't know. So there's two more things before we wrap up, because there's two more things I did want to talk about. You wrote something for Rage Against the Minivan about your time in Murrieta, California. I think it was probably 2 years ago, maybe longer, when there were a prison in Texas was overcrowded with illegal immigrants, people who had been arrested, families, kids who had been put in this detention facility, and they didn't have enough space, or they didn't have enough like heaters or food or whatever provisions. And so they were shipping people in buses to California to be in a different detention center. They would still be detained, but they would be sent to California. And the entire town, basically, with the mayor, showed up to protest the buses coming into their town. And you went there with actually protest banners and stuff, but not for that same reason, right?
Yeah, I wanted to have a counter protest of love. Here's something. I'm a very opinionated person. I have a lot of ideas, political. I'm very interested in political theology, meaning the intersection of how society works with ideas about God, and particularly the Christian God. And so I have a lot of ideas, but I'm kind of a loser, in terms of action. I have nothing to boast about in terms of protesting maybe if you knew more about my life, there's some things that I've done that maybe somebody can consider noble. I think it's all very unimpressive.
Sure.
I'm very much in my head. I'm nothing like my heroes. It's kind of like rock and roll. I have heroes like Dorothy Day, Oscar Romero, the Barricade brothers. Those people, I have nothing on them. They're like the Radiohead and the Beatles, and I'm just tinkering around.
But people who inspire you, right?
Yeah, so it's very much the same as when I was in rock and roll. I'm a big fan, but not the greatest practitioner. But in this case, for whatever reason, it was close and it moved me. In the year 2014, and there's some bleed over into 2015, there's a huge influx of unaccompanied minors from Central America, in particular El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. At the time, I went to Honduras. I told you that that we toured military bases around 2000.
Mm-hmm.
I went to Honduras, and it was a scary place then, immediately. And now it's the number one place for murder in the world.
So people leaving or fleeing violence for their lives.
Oh, they're refugees.
Yeah.
And it's extreme. And a lot of it is because of the United States war on drugs and their partnership with Mexico for the same. And so what happens is we forced these cartels to take over entire nations. And at the time, it was safer to be a teenager in Syria than it was to be a teenager not in a drug cartel in Honduras.
Wow.
And so it's a war zone. And I guess America, we're not real big on refugees nowadays. But the thing about refugees is that my family came from, my dad's Jewish, and our family fled the rise of fascism in Eastern Europe. And you may or may not know that the United States turned away shiploads of Jews fleeing the Nazis, and they went back to their death.
I'll link in the bottom of the show notes some of the images of the boats being turned around.
Yeah, and so my family went to Argentina, and then my dad moved from Argentina to the United States at age 4. But these minors, there's this ugly. Oh, and by the way, Guatemala and El Salvador at the time were I think number 3 and number 5 for the same, for violence. These unaccompanied minors, what that means is without adults. And I want you to imagine in California, a child going to Arizona unaccompanied. Now imagine going through these lawless places where there's this violence and where their family members may have been killed. And they're coming all the way from Central America to Texas.
It's too hard to even grasp.
Yeah.
Honestly.
How many of those died on the way?
Mm-hmm.
How many of those were sexually assaulted? And so they're showing up, and what you have is there's just been this angry anti-immigrant, very xenophobic turn in the United States, where people are like, I'm sick of Mexicans coming to take my job. Well, first off, that was Presidents Clinton and Bush that shipped your jobs away. It wasn't some Mexican.
That's well said.
And two, these are not Mexicans. These are little Guatemalan children with nobody who are fleeing because their parents can't protect them or because their parents have been murdered. They can't be forced into prostitution and forced into the drug trade. They got to escape. And so they come to the United States, and all of a sudden you have all these white, these angry white working class people yelling at them and saying that they're not welcome. And so
literally yelling at their bus that they've already been detained. They've already been put in prison or in jail. Right. And they're on a bus being shipped to another place, but they're not even welcome at that other jail because there's people standing in the street blocking the buses. Yeah,
it was merciless. And I don't want to judge too hard, because what's happened is, especially since the 90s, and it's bipartisan, but what's happened since the 90s is that I really think that there's a couple of pressures on working class white people in the United States. One is their income has gone down, their jobs have gone down, their jobs have been shipped away, there's been unemployment problems, and then people have taken advantage of the fact that then there's these other people coming in that get help, or that their place in society is slipping, and that's a very frightening thing. And it's, right now it's very easy to call that the Trumpification of the United States. You have to ask, who does it serve to fear and hate other poor people?
Yeah.
Who does it serve? It serves people who are in positions of power.
That could be said over and over, and it still wouldn't be said enough.
Yeah. And so they're trapped by their own bondage too, because they don't know how to release themselves from those problems as long as there's a scapegoat. As long as the answer is to reject refugees, to put up walls, then guess what? Those aren't the people that are actually causing your problems. And I'm really sensitive to it because of my family fleeing Nazi Germany and fleeing Eastern Europe as the Nazis spread across the land. My other grandmother on my mother's side was a WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant in Europe, and her father was a member of the Nazi Party. So I have both Nazis on one side and Jews fleeing the Nazis on the other. And that's a pretty good American melting pot type of background. So if I contradict myself, just think that's my heritage.
It's just the stories that you belong to.
Exactly. And so, that happened there, where they would scapegoat gays, gypsies, Jews, and anybody really who didn't fit in. And the thing is, that sort of force in a large group, it becomes a demonic force. It becomes a power that is larger than any one person's moral decisions. And everybody gets swept up in a very destructive hate that ends up ruining everybody's lives.
Because nobody would say they hate someone that they don't know.
Yeah.
But they are a part of the bigger whole that is something bigger than them. Yeah.
So the gist was that, my wife, my son, and a friend and an older lady from church, we went there just to be some sort of peaceful counter protest. All we did, who knows if it does any good, we made signs. I brought my guitar and we sang songs like Jesus Loves the Little Children or Lord Make Us Instruments of Peace. And it was a little overwhelming because, here the people of Murrieta and Temecula and Menifee, they petitioned federal dollars in order to have these jobs, to have this, immigration center. And then when it's actually called to do its job, everybody freaks out and starts basically terrorizing these poor people.
Yeah.
And for me, I think the ultimate thing is this. My allegiance is first and foremost to Christ and to his church, because I actually believe that the church is called as a people of God. I don't care about the border as much as I care about the stranger. I just don't. And I don't think you can. If you are a believing Jew or a believing Christian, Leviticus 19:26, you need to treat the alien as if they were a stranger. The whole loving your neighbor as yourself. We need to remember that, that Jesus himself, living in the Roman Empire, that was the largest empire that the world had seen to date. And Jesus was the refugee. He was on the edges and the margins of that empire, to the extent that he was basically killed in a political execution. And so the idea that in America somehow Christianity has been aligned with some of these malignant. I'm really afraid, especially with American Protestantism. But you know what? There's some Catholics and there's some Episcopalians. It's across the board. Christianity in America has somehow got Christianity in America conflated.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't realize that, they'll put a not of this world sticker on their truck. And
I did that, by the way, on my truck.
Yeah. I saw a t-shirt that was a not of this world t-shirt that had like the American flag and like a ribbon, like about supporting our troops. And I'm like, what part of not of this world do you not understand?
Because that is a reference to citizenship, right? I mean, like that's what the discussion was about, that little saying came from.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And again, you don't
want to judge too hard, but it is something you've seen from or came from in the past.
Yeah, I don't want to judge too hard because this is where I was. I mean, I voted for George W. Bush.
Can you say that like 3 more times, just like get it really clear? No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. I've repented. But what I'm really glad for in becoming an Episcopalian was the idea that, there's a lot of other Christians in the world. Like there's Christians in China. There's more Christians in China than in the United States. The Roman Catholic Church, they don't care there's nobody in the Roman Catholic Church becoming atheists because of evolution. They understand that evolution is a scientific theory and that the Old Testament is a religious book that is meant to be interpreted in light of its history. And, but American Protestantism is just stuck in this modernist mindset. And similarly, when you're a Roman Catholic or an Anglican, you can go to a church anywhere in the world and you can participate, even if it's not in your language.
Yeah.
There's something that binds you together.
And for you, that's the prayer, that's the Eucharist, that's the actions of being the people of God that kind of transcend the language.
Yeah. And so for me, that's our citizenship. So I have an allegiance. It is disgusting to me that, when you think about World War I or World War II, I think the last century, everybody thinks that liberal democracy saved the world from religious wars. I don't believe that at all. I believe that the modern age is most filled with blood. You got to think the world's foremost liberal democracy murdered entire cities in Japan, killed civilians. And yet when, if Muslims come here and kill 3,000 people in an attack a decade ago, everybody just we go into the longest war in U.S. history.
Yeah, it begins a protracted decade and a half of difficult things.
It's just a never-ending cycle of violence. But, man, it wasn't anything to drop a nuclear warhead in Nagasaki. And I've been there. And nobody thinks about it because they think, oh, well, it's for the greater good and it hastens the end of the war. But
that's the same. It's hard to hear that because that's the same justification for terrorism. Is that we're affecting the greater good.
Yeah, it really is. I don't see the difference. I am okay because I'm a Christian. I'm perfectly happy with people dying for their beliefs. If anybody wants to die for their beliefs, I'm fine. The problem with 9/11 was not that people died for their beliefs; it's that they killed for their beliefs.
Absolutely.
And the problem afterwards is that they've been killing for their beliefs ever since. And frankly, the United States killed a lot more for their beliefs than any of them have. And I just don't believe killing for your beliefs is right. It's a real, you mentioned me getting kicked out of a church because of my beliefs. The final straw, I had let them know from the beginning that, that I was there to participate, to help lead worship, to support the prayers and praises of the church. But I will not engage in any liturgies of nationalism. Because when we come around the table, the communion table, that has no nation other than the heavenly country. And so what happened was on that day, they baptized a young man, basically because he was enlisting that afternoon. And there was a prayer offered that was basically for basically that he would do well in his duties. And for me, I'm like, at the end of every service, we say, go in peace to love and serve the Lord. I can't say go in peace to love and serve the Lord, and at the same time say go in war and in violence to love and serve your country. Those are totally incompatible, because I believe in a God, what I see in Christ, and everybody's going to argue with this, but the gist of it is that what I see in Christ, the fullest explanation of who God is, the very image of the invisible God, that no one has seen the Father, but God the Son, who is close to the Father's heart, has made him known. When I see Jesus, I see a God that would rather suffer violence than cause it. And it happens over and over again. It's his explicit teachings throughout the entire gospel. It's the underpinning of his entire career. And eventually he's crushed, basically.
That's the real controversy, is that God would choose to do that. And God wouldn't strike first.
Yeah, so when Jesus tells Peter, the only innocent victim in the world would have been Christ. And when Peter tries to defend him, Jesus says, no, put away your sword. It's just, that's something I can't let go of. And I can't say that there's some universal principle that some poor people somewhere are being put upon and they pick up a rock. I'm not going to make that. But what I can say is this, is that what that shows me unequivocally is that when God is faced with human violence, what he does is he goes and he accepts it, and he accepts it upon himself rather than dish it out. And so people can ask you all sorts of questions. What about the Old Testament? God killed all these people. I don't believe that. People will write me off because of that. That's fine.
Actually, history itself shows, and people like Pete Enns have said that, like, the genocidal stuff that you see actually didn't happen the way that it says it happened. There's stories of origination and identity. Anyway, that's totally an aside.
But also people will talk about things in the New Testament and this, that, and the other thing. To me, it just doesn't matter. Same thing with Paul. Our struggle's not against flesh and blood. When he talks about the weapons of our warfare, they're things like truth, faith, the sword of the Spirit. He basically is saying, like, our weapons are not the weapons of the world.
Yeah, these are our weapons, as in not the other ones.
Yeah, not the other ones.
So for you, it really is Jesus that you look at, and Jesus, that the picture of God that seals the deal for you. Man, there's so much more that I would like to ask you about, especially the idea of not holding on to like a rule across the board for all time that nobody can commit any sort of violence. Like, that's something I've been thinking about lately, because I'm a pacifist, and that has lately come up. I've been thinking about whether that's my fundamentalism just in a new way or not. Anyway, that's an interesting conversation, and there's so much more, but we have to wrap up. And I just wanted to say thank you so much, Joey, for coming on here, talking about Skypark. I'm sure some people are going to go listen to your band. I hope they do. Talking about deconstructing your faith and the Charismanglican. May it rest in peace forever. May it rest in the slothful heaven that someday we will all be able to enjoy. But thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, it's been a total pleasure. I have so much respect for you. I'm glad that we've stayed in touch online, and I'm really glad that we got to talk. I'm honored that you think my ramblings are even worth putting out in the world. My apologies to the victims of this podcast and my own ideas.
May they be many. May be many.
Well, God bless. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Joey.